Hi, I'm Dan Porterfield, the CEO of the Aspen Institute, here with Sandra Clark, who is the CEO of StoryCorps, and we are at Aspen Ideas Health for Ideas Off Stage. It's fun to have you here today.
Well, it's great to be here.
You've been here for a couple days. I hear you've made some waves with some great comments in your panels.
Yeah.
Let's catch up our viewers
Yeah.
on what is StoryCorps, its mission, and its main work in the world.
Well, StoryCorps, I was thinking about this at the Big Ideas conversation the other night and imagining StoryCorps 20 years ago. This is our 20th anniversary. And really the idea of StoryCorps is that we know in plain sight there are stories from everyday people. So StoryCorps is all about stories of everyday people who are often not seen, not heard, never asked to share their stories. But what we know is that people have stories about their lived experience about humanity. We need more humanity in the world. About how they have, how they have connected with each other, and through listening to these stories, we also find ways to connect with each other that we don't know, right? And so StoryCorps started just as an idea to create a more just and compassionate world by connecting people and creating these levels of understanding about our lives that really bind us more than separate us.
Well, I'm a recovering English professor.
Oh,
I taught at
okay.
Georgetown and
Right.
Franklin and Marshall
Yeah.
before coming here, so I've known about your work for a while.
Yeah.
I think it's wonderful. And I've thought about it a little bit recently with the U.S. Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, who's here at Ideas Health, who has sort of alerted the country he sees an epidemic of loneliness. And maybe stories have some way to help us address that epidemic. What do you think?
I think what we see in these stories, and look, we hear all the time StoryCorps stories. When you hear them on the radio, they make you pull the car over. You find yourself in tears. What is that thing, right? That evokes that kind of emotion. And it is because I think when we listen to those stories, we feel so much more connected to people. We don't feel as alone in the world. We understand that there are pathways to create these personal transformations as well as impacting our own communities by listening to these stories. So that's the StoryCorps magic, is that you have two people who are sitting across from each other who enter a StoryCorps booth, and we have a mobile tour that still crosses the country, capturing stories in small towns and big cities. And we never tell anyone what to say when they come into the booth. They come in with somebody who they want to honor by listening to their story. And so I think, hearing those stories and actually having a moment with somebody where you're sharing a story that is so important to you is the thing that makes you feel less lonely, right? Yeah. And just by, these stories we have an audience of 14 million on NPR each week that listens to these stories. We have animations that are on YouTube. People binge listen and watch StoryCorps stories because they want to feel something and feel connected.
What do you think storytelling does for the tellers?
Oh, that's a really great question. Sometimes we've asked ourselves, is it more impactful if you're telling the story, if you're listening to the story? I think for the tellers, it's an opportunity to share, to feel like you matter. Yeah. And that really means a lot, right? Is that there's somebody who is saying that, whatever it is that you're sharing with us, your story matters not just to me, but to a lot of other people. Sometimes we don't even know we have stories in ourselves. And it's that quietude of that booth is what draws up all of this. It's the listening that draws up these stories. So I think it's just knowing that you matter.
You said in one of your panel discussions here that listening is an act of love. Say a little more.
Yeah. Well, if we think through our average day, how often we talk versus how often we listen, I think listening is a choice. And oftentimes we don't make the choice to listen to each other. In this world that we're in right now, we're seeing a lot of that, right? But it is an act of love because you're giving someone, a chance to tell a story, but also you're absorbing it, right? And listening is just the first step, because what happens after listening is often that you feel empathy and you understand someone a little bit better, or the world connects a little bit more than you thought. After that, it could lead to something else, which is that, you feel something more deeply that then becomes a deeper form of love, right? About wanting to now share and radiate humanity in the way that the person who was sharing the story with you did.
Storytellers and listeners are embarking on a relationship
Yes.
together.
Yeah.
That then, how do you honor that relationship? As a listener, you honor it by allowing the person to share what they have and being engaged with it?
Yeah, well, it's inviting them in some
Inviting them,
ways,
yeah.
right? Even before you walk into a StoryCorps booth, you're telling someone that you matter to me. And it's really interesting how you may come into the booth with one story you want to tell, but as the conversation goes on, there's actually something deeper that you want to reveal about
Yeah.
yourself with that kind of trust
Yeah.
that has been formed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you're a new CEO. You became the CEO about a year ago. Chances are you weren't thinking 15 years ago you'd become the CEO
I
of
wasn't thinking a
StoryCorps.
year ago I was going to be the CEO of StoryCorps.
So what's it been like starting in
Yeah.
this role? And what's something that you're looking forward to in the development of StoryCorps?
Yeah. Well, sometimes I think things come to us, the things that come to us that are least expected are the ones that are the most
Yeah.
enriching. And so most of my career has been in local news. And when StoryCorps, came to me, there was a very personal piece about that too. My mother's from Japan, my father's African American. I think of these two people who, from very different cultures. My dad was a career soldier. And I think of, how growing up, I never saw a single image of my parents represented in media.
Yeah.
I didn't see it in a
Yeah.
textbook. I never saw it on TV. And I think, so when StoryCorps came, my first thought was, my gosh, I wish I knew about StoryCorps and my parents could have shared their story because none of us got to see anything like their story as we were growing up, And so there's this personal piece of being
Yeah.
at StoryCorps. I love working with Dave Isay, the founder. Thinking of how some of these StoryCorps stories are probably even more impactful and kind of reach people in a different way than covering news all day
Yeah.
long, right? At StoryCorps, we say we whisper in your ear and we don't hit you over the head. We also don't make people make choices and choosing one side or another. For me as a CEO, I want everyone to know what StoryCorps is and everyone to experience it. Our North Star is, and this is fresh,
Yeah.
right? Because StoryCorps, we've often described ourselves as connecting people, creating, more understanding, which is all of that. But we are leaning in on, StoryCorps helping people believe in each other. And that's that's
Yeah.
another step,
Yeah.
right? By illuminating the
Yeah.
possibility and the humanity in all of us one story at a time.
So as you think about the organization's development over the next year or two, is there how should we keep up with it?
Well, there's many ways to
Yeah.
keep up with it. One, you can download the StoryCorps app. So, the app is about access for all.
Yeah,
We
good.
know that StoryCorps can't be everywhere,
Yeah.
but many people want to share their stories and also archive them for generations to come. Our big project right now is called One Small Step, where we are helping to bridge the political divide, that cross-partisan sort of politics that divides us now. But it's not talking about politics. It's the StoryCorps way of how do we see each other as human beings first. And so we can match a Republican and a Democrat, but we also know we have two people who might be grandparents or veterans, right? And they're going to find some commonality that then sets the stage for them to go, you know what, we're not as divided as we think, and how can we come together, maybe even to problem solve?
So imagine we could wave our magic wand and have someone come here to do a StoryCorps interview with you. I would step out. So who would you like it to be?
Yeah, well, I'm the asker of the questions. So no. You know what? I would love to have had a StoryCorps interview with my dad. And for one reason, I mean, he, as we were growing up, here he was a career military guy, retired in the middle of Salina, Kansas, tall African American guy, became a mall walker after he retired, and the fact that he endured plenty of racism and at the same time raised the flag in front of our house every day. it drove us crazy that he wore his Purple Heart hat all the time
Yeah.
because we were kids. We're like, well, how about Nike? How about
Yeah.
Adidas, right? We had no idea as military kids what it meant that you had a Purple Heart
Yeah.
and not just one, but multiple Purple Hearts. So I think I would want to talk to my dad to hear about his experiences, but also just to say I'm sorry,
Yeah.
right? Because I think we didn't honor him the way that we could have had we known.
Yeah,
Right?
the generations often feel that way about
Yeah.
those before us.
Yeah.
If we could have one more opportunity to listen and to understand, and StoryCorps makes that possible by creating and archiving
Yes.
these stories.
Yeah.
Someday, I predict, if not already, there's going to be scholars coming to you to wonder how they could perhaps learn from the archive.
Well, they do already,
do
by the
they?
way.
Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, our archive, we've had more than 600,000
Yeah.
participants in 20 years. Most people want to archive their stories at the Library of Congress so that we can come and tap into it. And so researchers come all the time. Sometimes it's family history and sometimes it's big things like 9/11, the pandemic,
Yeah.
right? We have an animation, that features somebody who was a midwife, born in slavery. And as we're talking about, maternal health issues, particularly for Black women now, you can't disconnect those two
Yeah.
stories.
Well, I learned a lot today, Sandy. Thank you. Maybe a last question.
Yeah.
Storytelling, listening, and making stories available are clearly an act of hope. Why would you do it if you didn't have hope? Can I ask, what gives you hope in this time, in this moment, as you take on this big role for this important organization?
I have to say, just the hope is really from these stories of everyday people. You can't listen to those stories and give up, right? These are people who have never given up. And so what gives me hope is that I know that there's way more of that out there than the stuff that we hear every single day.
Yeah.
And if only we knew,
Yeah.
right? I think more of us would have more hope than we do now because
Yeah.
we only hear kind of you run to the fire, right?
Yeah.
So we hear that side of things, but boy, if people could see and experience and participate in StoryCorps and just storytelling in whatever kind of way
Yeah.
that existed at the beginning
Yeah.
of time,
It's,
right?
it's oral traditions,
That's right.
everything.
Yeah, and that's what's created
Yeah.
the resilience
Yeah.
and hope as
Exactly.
we've gone through history from the very beginning. So that gives me hope.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, that's pretty big. Thank you. I'm going to download the app.
Yeah. Please.
And thank you so much for being a big part of Aspen Ideas Health
Well,
this year.
thank you for having StoryCorps
All right.
here.
Good
I
stuff.
appreciate it.
All
Yeah.
right.